truth is the most convincing story that maps onto reality, and that's why the central narrative is falling apart.
Right now in the United States, people should not be walking around with masks.
We must see the central narrative for the fiction that it is. We are Americans.
While elections are sometimes messy, this was a secure election.
The founders began the fight for human liberty and self-governance, and it's up to us to finish the job.
I'll tell you what, we are in a truth emergency right now.
This is the end game.
It's Wednesday, March 27th, 2024, the 1162nd day of dystopia. I'm your moderator, Chris Paul. Let's be reasonable. A warm welcome and hello to all of you listening to the podcast on the day of its release. The only way to do that is by becoming a paid subscriber at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as little as $50 a year or $5 a month. And in doing so, you will be supporting me, the work I do, and this show as it expands. And if you can't, or you simply don't want to, continue listening to the podcast for free a couple days later on a wide variety of podcast platforms. And of course, Rumble. All I ask is that you share it with your friends. You can find the links to the podcast, the writing, the social media, and the merch site by visiting linktree.com/I'mYourModerator. So to begin today, let's just catch up. We've been tracking this story, so let's just catch up and see where we're at. And when I refer to the story we've been tracking, I mean the Trump is broke narrative. Remember how just last week Trump was broke and he was going to lose all his cash that he was going to spend on his campaign. Then he wouldn't be able to campaign. And ha, 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 look at that. Donald Trump can't campaign. We got the government to make sure that Donald Trump couldn't campaign. We win. Go freedom. So Trump wasn't going to be able to campaign, and then they were going to just chip away at his whole business empire. Just take him apart piece by piece, have the government steal his various properties, and soon he won't be a real estate mogul at all. He'll be a failure, just like we've always said he would be. If only the government would turn that private citizen and businessman and celebrity and cultural icon and, yeah, I guess I got to say it, the greatest president we've ever had, into a failure. So they said last week he was going broke. He was already broke, and it was getting worse. In fact, actually, you got to back up. He never had his fortune to begin with. You got to remember that. That's what they told us in 2015 and 2016. The whole thing was a fraud right from the beginning. He was never a rich man. He got rich off his father's money, never made a right move in his life. In fact, he just declared bankruptcy after bankruptcy. Just a failure his entire life. I mean, sure, he was a real estate mogul, was a TV icon and celebrity, and then he was president, and he still flies around in a giant plane and has all of the most extravagant properties in the world. But he's still a failure, don't you understand? Here's how much of a failure he is. This is the Daily Mail this morning. It's even worse than Bloomberg yesterday. Trump's media company is valued at $8 billion after surging on the first day of trades, more than the New York Times and Mattel. And Mattel, they're the people that make Barbie. Barbie is the most famous toy of all time and also the best, most Oscar-winning movie we've ever seen. Donald Trump's new media company ended its day of active first day of trading. That is what the article actually says. It can't even make it through a single sentence, but I will translate that into an intelligible sentence. Donald Trump's new media company ended its active first day of trading valued at $8 billion, more than established firms like the New York Times and Mattel, amid warnings investors were putting their money on Trump rather than the firm itself. Now that is absolutely stunning to read in the pages of a mainstream media outlet, and not just because they used an apostrophe in the possessive its. Here they are saying that everybody is betting on Donald Trump and not the actual value of the underlying company. So they are valuing Donald Trump as the true investment here, and he, solely as an avatar for this company, is worth $8 billion. That is what we are being told. This is kind of a lose-lose sort of bind for them. How popular must Donald Trump be to warrant that? How confident must people be in Donald Trump's future to warrant that? Oh, no, of course. He's just fooling his supporters again. But they're even kind of missing there. Why are his supporters so confident in him? Didn't Joe Biden receive 81 million real lawful American votes, the most popular president in history? And didn't that allow him to go on to achieve the full implementation of his agenda with a full public mandate and supporters just cheering his name everywhere he went? Well, no, people hate Biden. Stadiums full of people chant, "Let's go, Brandon," and F Joe Biden. I didn't want to make you do earmuffs in the car 2 days in a row. And let's just stick with this Daily Mail article for a couple more seconds. At one point, during the heat of its first day of trading on the NASDAQ, the firm that owns Truth Social was valued at $10 billion, despite having just $3 million in revenue for the first 9 months of last year. Even after the stock price cooled to $57.99, the firm was worth more than firms with loads of users and established track records. The Times, which was established in 1851 and reported on the firm's public trading debut, which put its value as greater than Barbie maker Mattel, is valued at about $7 billion. Its share price is about 2,000 times revenue. Online message board Reddit, which had its own splashy debut days ago, has a similar market cap but boasts 268 million active users. Its value was less than 10 times its revenue. That happened last week, and the mainstream media was gleeful about their launch. I wonder why Trump's isn't treated the same. Watchdogs are already warning that Trump's huge stake in the firm presents an influence opportunity, even beyond ethics issues that popped up when he decided not to sell his empire when he got elected in 2016 or place assets in a blind trust. Why are they still mad about that? If Donald Trump did something illegal, wouldn't they have gone after him for it? They tried to accuse him and convict him hundreds, if not thousands of times in the press and in the court of public opinion, but somehow he just got away with this ethics violation. You got to love when the media is like, hey, remember this thing we tried to make you care about 8 or 9 years ago and no one cared about? Well, it's still really bad and really important. No, it's not. Truth Social has also missed its projected user base by an order of magnitude. It's not a successful company. It's not a company that seems to have a plan for success for making money. It's just essentially a meme. Jordan Libovitz of Citizens for Responsible Ethics in Washington said. So it's all based on what people are putting money into. Libowitz told dailymail.com. I think that this article is honestly written by a retarded AI or something. It's so bad. And I'm referring to the actual writing, the words on the page and the typeset. It's not really Truth Social. They're investing in a potential future president of the United States. His net worth becomes controlled by whether people are buying or selling stock. Now, a foreign investment fund like Saudi Arabia or Qatar can buy a bunch of it, boost his net worth, threaten to sell it in order to tank the net worth, and have an extreme amount of influence over the president of the United States. And I have to assume that is the same guy talking because the Daily Mail article just doesn't bother telling us. But there's the angle. Donald Trump is going to be controlled by foreign influences who are going to invest in his social media company, and immediately, once again, that should catch your ear because it is the same standard that they were applying to TikTok in the legislation they've been trying to pass to ban TikTok from the app stores unless ByteDance chooses to divest and sell TikTok to an American company. Now, what does the future of open communications and free speech look like over the course of the next year as we get through this transitional period and figure out how all of this is going to wind down somehow. We can tell that they are ramping up for more censorship. They want to be able to shut down TikTok, and they may well succeed on that. They may get back to being able to censor on YouTube, on Instagram, on Facebook, on Snapchat, etc. Twitter is already a censored space. I mean, X, formerly Twitter. People can talk about how it is a bastion of free speech, or at least they are pushing toward free speech principles, and Elon is doing the best he can, and the code was just booby-trapped all over the place, making it nearly impossible to unwind the censorship mechanisms that were built in. But it's been a year and a half, and there's no real proof that's true. There is a big marketing campaign to convince everyone that it is. So free speech options are very limited. Then we have Truth Social operating on the Rumble Cloud. The Rumble Cloud is separate from Amazon Web Services, so they can't apply pressure through AWS to shut down Truth Social. And then you have the emergence of Starlink and the potential for peer-to-peer communications via that satellite without the range of different middlemen we have now. And if I'm understanding this correctly, what seems to be emerging is a parallel communications infrastructure that cannot be taken down by the global regime. Now, that ends up putting a lot of faith in someone like Elon Musk, but Elon Musk really isn't the force behind SpaceX and Starlink and Tesla and the rest of it. That is the U.S. government and the Defense Department. So then it becomes a question of whether or not the U.S. military is faithful to the U.S. Constitution and to the people of the United States. And we have to hope and pray that they are. This is something that people have counted on for quite a long time now. This can and should be another example of how critical the answer to that particular question is. Now, I don't know that I'm right about all that, but if I am right about all that, then a parallel system emerges, and that parallel system will be where everyone runs to when they see that the system they are in is completely, totally, irredeemably compromised. And people who may have an idea on that being the future, having them supporting DJT on the stock ticker and Truth Social and TMTG more broadly, considering that Trump might be moving quickly to acquire other media properties, I would suspect he will be doing that. And it would also make sense that there would be people in the know about this stuff who would be getting behind this project. So the idea that this is all just about Trump's little upstart social media platform, and that's the only way that there could end up being value in this company, that is crazy. That is not a full and complete understanding of this situation. Now, it's also entirely possible that people have bet wrong about this. Maybe none of what I just said is true, and it is just about Donald Trump's personal brand and personal value. Are we to believe that it's his enemies inflating this price so that his supporters will then buy in and then lose all their money when all the very smart people pull out? Well, hey, that's the chance everyone takes with absolutely everything. And the people warning us about that possibility are the same people who told us that if we stood 6 feet apart and put a tiny piece of perforated cloth over our faces, we could defend ourselves against the very deadliest pandemic of all time. Now, much of the discussion on Trump being broke revolves around that case in New York brought by Letitia James, decided by Judge Engoron, where they claimed that Donald Trump defrauded someone, just committed a generalized fraud against no one and must be punished, by overstating real estate values of his properties on forms that he submitted to a bank to take out loans from the bank, loans that were paid back in full on time with interest. And the forms that he submitted, attached to those was a disclaimer saying that the banks should do their own due diligence because these valuations are only estimates from their point of view. Now, the whole case is about that, and that is the issue over which New York believes that Donald Trump is now in debt to the state of New York, nearly $600 million. And because they don't want to be seen as just going around taking Donald Trump's properties away from him, they have to supply a public narrative that provides a moral justification for their seizure of his properties. It has to be about more than just the court case and more than just the bond, because they already haven't sold the court case well enough. And of course they haven't. The entire case is absurd. Well, one of the people they recruited to make that moral case for them was the former host of The Daily Show, Jon Stewart. He is now hosting The Daily Show on Monday nights so that he can bring his usual preachy, self-righteous, normie, shit-lib takes with a sort of gravitas that the other late-night comics just don't have. Jon Stewart, you see, is a serious part of the conversation, not like Stephen Colbert, who dances around with she-males advertising vaccines. But then the New York Post goes and publishes this today. Jon Stewart found to have overvalued his New York City home by 829% after labeling Trump's civil case not victimless. And that's really the crux of the issue here. Trump hasn't actually defrauded anyone. There is legitimately no victim here, and the supposed victims agree with Trump that they weren't victims. So the communists need to figure out some way that Trump was wrong anyway to make him morally culpable, which will allow them to seize all his property. So Jon Stewart is out there doing yeoman's work, trying to convince the public that Donald Trump is very, very bad. So Jon Stewart led in with an exchange between CNN's Laura Coates and that guy from Shark Tank who apparently just tells everyone what to think about everything now for some reason. He's like the star of cable news, Kevin O'Leary. Maybe he's just like Trump's buddy, and Trump was like, hey, Kevin, we'll make you famous for a while. Go out there and tell people just obvious and normal things. And I guess Kevin O'Leary has the clout to be able to convince people of obvious and normal things. So kudos to him. Anyway, the New York Post writes, Coates responds to O'Leary by highlighting that Trump was found liable for falsifying business records in the second degree, issuing false financial statements, insurance fraud, and conspiracy, all due to asset inflation. Everything that you just listed off is done by every real estate developer everywhere on earth, in every city. This has never been prosecuted, O'Leary replied. In response, Stewart asked, this is when he comes in with his self-righteousness and his preachiness, always in defense of blatant Marxism. Stewart says, how is he not this mad about overvaluations in the real world? Because they are not victimless crimes. To further his point, Stewart argued that, quote, money isn't infinite. A loan that goes to the liar doesn't go to someone who's giving a more honest evaluation. So the system becomes incentivized for corruption, end quote. Stewart also contended that failing to declare a higher market value on a property while paying taxes based on a lower assessed value constitutes fraudulent behavior. Stewart says the Attorney General of New York knew that Trump's property values were inflated because when it came time to pay taxes, Trump undervalued the very same properties. It was all part of a very specific real estate practice known as lying. Oh, that's where the humor comes in. But here's the fun part. It didn't take long for internet sleuths to look into Stewart's own property history, which shows an overvaluation of his New York City penthouse by a staggering 829%. Records confirmed by the Post show. In 2014, Stewart sold his 6,280 square foot Tribeca duplex to financier Parag Pandey for $17.5 million. The property's asking price at that time is not available in the listing records, but according to 2013-2014 assessor records obtained by the Post, the property had the estimated market value at only $1.882 million. The actual assessor valuation was even lower at $847,174. Records also show that Stewart paid significantly lower property taxes, which were calculated based on that assessor valuation price, precisely what he called Trump out for doing in his Monday monologue. Pandy, who purchased the penthouse from Stewart, then resold the property at a nearly 26% loss, according to The Real Deal, at just over $13 million in 2021. So if Donald Trump is guilty of anything, then Jon Stewart is guilty of the exact same things. And of course, that's why he has to create an external problem, which is that Donald Trump has made it so that honest people can't get the money from the banks. And of course, that is ridiculous. But let's keep going with the Get Trump news, because we're in another big Get Trump cycle. This is from the New York Times yesterday. Judge imposes gag order on Trump in Manhattan criminal trial. The New York judge presiding over one of Donald J. Trump's criminal trials imposed a gag order on Tuesday that prohibits him from attacking witnesses, prosecutors, and jurors, the latest effort to rein in the former president's wrathful rhetoric about his legal opponents. The judge, Juan Merchan, imposed the order at the request of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, which brought the case against Mr. Trump. The district attorney, Alvin Bragg, has accused Mr. Trump of covering up a potential sex scandal during and after his 2016 campaign. Except that's not possible because they never had sex. That's according to Donald J. Trump and according to Stormy Daniels. And people are unaware, but Stormy Daniels owes Donald Trump about $600,000. It's not the other way around. The ruling comes on the heels of Justice Merchan setting an April 15th trial date, rejecting Mr. Trump's latest effort to delay the proceeding. It will mark the first criminal prosecution of a former American president. And that is rather hysterical. This is going to be the first time in American history that a president has been tried for a crime, and they had to create a novel legal theory in order to do it. They had to create an election finance crime after the FEC said there wasn't one, and combine it with what they call fraudulent bookkeeping. But what they really want to do is just bring out Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen and hope that everyone just forgets about Michael Avenatti and how all these people who are calling Trump guilty now were supporting Michael Avenatti for president. The dude is in prison for fraud. Under the judge's gag order, Mr. Trump cannot make or direct others to make statements about witnesses' roles in the case. Mr. Trump is also barred from commenting on prosecutors and court staff as well as their relatives if the statements were intended to interfere with their work in the case. In seeking the gag order last month, Mr. Bragg's prosecutors highlighted Mr. Trump's, quote, long-standing history of attacking witnesses, investigators, prosecutors, judges, and others involved in legal proceedings against him, end quote, comments that the judge seized on in his ruling. His statements were threatening, inflammatory, denigrating. Justice Merchan wrote in the Tuesday order. Isn't he a judge, not a justice? Here's how the New York Times writers conclude. In a rambling and angry post on his social media site on Tuesday, Mr. Trump made an ominous reference to Mr. Cohen, claiming without explanation that his former fixer was, quote, deaf. He also referred to one of Mr. Bragg's prosecutors in pejorative terms. Both comments would now arguably violate the gag order. In another post, Mr. Trump took aim at Justice Merchan and his family, claiming that the judge, quote, hates me, unquote, though those comments do not appear to cross the line the judge has now set. So the New York Times is creating an all-new way for its child-brained readers to feel like an injustice is being committed against them by Donald Trump. They actually have assumed the mindset. They believe that Donald Trump is attacking them with this stuff. They feel like he is out there just criming away, violating their just and lawful society. And so let's see exactly how Donald Trump is violating them. This is from Truth Social yesterday. DA Bragg fought everyone about trying this quote unquote no crime case, but crooked Joe Biden's thugs pushed him to go forward and pushed him hard. They wanted him to go after me, Crooked's political opponent. He just didn't want to do it. They ended up sending Matthew Colangelo, Merrick Garland's right hand, after a stop at the corrupt and racist New York State AG Letitia Peekaboo James's office to directly oversee the DA, perhaps to make sure that Bragg followed their illegal orders and commands. He eventually agreed to do the case that he never wanted to do. Pomerantz and Cohen were quote unquote deaf. Now their hope is that Judge Juan Merchan, who should be recused, will pull them through. Stop the steal. It's interesting that he adds stop the steal onto that. Also, it's worth noting that the New York Times pointed out that Donald Trump used that quote unquote death, and Trump has the quotes there too, in reference to Michael Cohen, but they don't mention that in reference to Pomerantz. Why not? Trump went back for another bite at the apple this morning in a series of Truth Social posts. Judge Juan Merchan, who is suffering from an acute case of Trump derangement syndrome, whose daughter represents crooked Joe Biden, Kamala Harris, Adam Shifty Schiff, and other radical liberals, has just posted a picture of me behind bars, her obvious goal, and makes it completely impossible for me to get a fair trial. And the judge has now issued another illegal, un-American, unconstitutional order as he continues to try and take away my rights. This judge, by issuing a vicious gag order, is wrongfully attempting to deprive me of my First Amendment right to speak out against the weaponization of law enforcement, including the fact that crooked Joe Biden, Merrick Garland, and their hacks and thugs are tracking and following me all across the country, obsessively trying to persecute me while everyone knows I have done nothing wrong. And he goes on. So let me get this straight. The judge's daughter is allowed to post pictures of her quote unquote dream of putting me in jail. The Manhattan DA is able to say whatever lies about me he wants. The judge can violate our laws and Constitution at every turn, but I am not allowed to talk about the attacks against me and the lunatics trying to destroy my life and prevent me from winning the 2024 presidential election, which I am dominating. Maybe the judge is such a hater because his daughter makes money by working to, quote unquote, get Trump. And when he rules against me over and over again, he is making her money and her richer and richer. How can this be allowed? That is a pretty extreme conflict of interest we're dealing with here. The judge has to recuse himself immediately and right the wrong committed by not doing so last year. If the biased and conflicted judge is allowed to stay on this sham case, it will be another sad example of our country becoming a banana republic, not the America we used to know and love. These are election interfering witch hunts. We will crush each one of these hoaxes and make America great again. Now, all of that is pretty clear. Again, we are going to see a template for how things are treated in the future. He is getting all of the Trump deranged to argue against his positions, no matter what position that means they're committed to arguing for. They know the position is anti-Trump, therefore it is correct. It must be correct because Trump is the enemy, Trump is the liar, Trump is the bad guy, so it must be true that he is in the wrong. And even if that is somehow not true, Trump is so dangerous that all of them are willing to violate any principle that they may have ever claimed to hold just in order to prevent that Trump danger from taking hold. That is how they explain the fact that they are just really operating in a manner totally devoid of principle or morality in the first place. Now, if you can't ultimately get Trump on any of the civil lawsuits or any of these indictments, well, then you're going to have to revert back to other get Trump strategies. And Trump haters are more than happy to pursue all of those avenues at once at this point. It's all just converging on the same timeline. It has to, based on the society-wide expectation that in November, on November 5th, the people of this nation will make their voices heard, even if that's not really true. The expectation is there. People's minds are converging on this particular moment in time when this decision will be made, regardless of whether or not it's made in the scope of a fair election, a rigged election, or something else. From Politico yesterday, assured failure. Ex-White House lawyer provides new details of final days of Trump's 2020 election gambit. This is by Politico's Kyle Cheney. Just an absolutely worthless regime propagandist. Donald Trump's deputy White House counsel, Pat Philbin, was nervous. It was just a few days until January 6, 2021, when Congress was slated to certify Joe Biden's victory in the 2020 election. And Trump had suddenly resuscitated a plan to place the leadership of the Justice Department with Jeffrey Clark, a little-known DOJ official who Trump expected to mount a sweeping nationwide effort to help him remain in power. Ah, yes, Donald Trump just couldn't let go of his grip on power, despite the fact that, for all most people know, that's exactly what he did. The proof otherwise was the very violent insurrection, but that's falling apart too, as is the belief among virtually anybody that Joe Biden actually received 81 million real lawful American votes. No one even takes that viewpoint seriously anymore. Which is, by the way, the reason why it's important to ask that question of people if you find yourself in an argument about politics. You have to qualify their ability to have a conversation with you. And if you refuse to do that because, you got to talk to everybody, you're going to run into a lot of problems. There is no point at having an hour-long political discussion with someone who believes that Joe Biden really received 81 million real lawful American votes until you find out whether or not they are able to prove that in any way. Newsflash, they're not. So if they're going to lie to you about that, or if they are going to be happy to repeat slogans to you, what productive conversation do you expect to have? They should at least be able to admit that they cannot prove that, and that none of their justifications constitute actual proof in any way whatsoever. Each and every one of them is an appeal to authority, and it happens to be an appeal to illegitimate and false authority on each one of those claims. But let's continue with this story now that Kyle Cheney has really built up our emotions here. So Philbin called Clark, a colleague from their days in private practice dating back to the 1990s, and tried to talk him out of it. What a hero. I tried to explain to him that it was a bad idea for multiple reasons. Philbin recalled Tuesday at a long-delayed disbarment hearing for Clark. Oh, yeah, you gotta make sure that Jeffrey Clark is disbarred because he encouraged alternate electors, something that is totally legitimate in practice. He would be starting down a path of assured failure. If by some miracle somehow it worked, there'd be riots in every major city in the country, and it was not an outcome the country would accept. Okay, so this guy, Pat Philbin, has called his old friend Jeffrey Clark to convince Clark not to get in back of Trump's claims about the obvious election theft that occurred on November 3rd, 2020. Because even if his efforts were effective, the country wouldn't accept it, and there would be violence in the streets. What kind of violence in the streets? Well, the violence described in the Transition Integrity Project's report, that war game scenario, where they were prepared for leftist violence in the streets if somehow Trump was the obvious winner. And there is a great discussion on this in the interview available on Badlands Media between John Harold and Mike Benz. They did that interview live on Badlands on Monday evening. You can find that on Rumble. You might even be able to find it on YouTube. There was absolutely violence in the streets planned if Donald Trump was the winner. The same sort of violence we saw throughout the Summer of Love. That was planned and funded and organized by leftists across the board, not Donald Trump. So what are people warning about when they suggest there's going to be left-wing violence in the streets and the country would not accept the result despite Trump being the legitimate winner? That is what Pat Philbin is arguing. Jeffrey Clark should not back these claims based on the results, not based on whether the claims are true, just based on the chaos that might ensue from the country learning that, in fact, the uniparty does steal elections, including for the president. And in fact, not only for the president, but for everybody at every level all around the country, right down to your local politicians and representatives, the city council in your city, the people making the rules and regulations by which you are forced to live are all equally illegitimate. And I would love if it was otherwise, but it's not otherwise. And until it can be proven otherwise, no one in this country has any reason to trust election officials or the politicians that certified their own wins in their own elections. But let's continue. It was Philbin's first public testimony about the chaotic final days of the Trump presidency since he left the White House. Though Philbin has spoken to both the January 6th Select Committee and the federal grand jury that indicted Trump for his effort to seize a second term, no transcript or recording of his remarks has even been released. Philbin's description of his interactions with Clark shed a new light on the frenzied effort by Trump to remake the Justice Department into a tool of his bid to cling to power despite losing the election. A remarkable new account more than 3 years after a mob of pro-Trump rioters stormed the Capitol in his name. His testimony followed Richard Donahue, a former acting deputy attorney general. Together, the two men described a White House that had let down all guardrails, with conspiracy theories about election fraud reaching Trump, who was an eager recipient of even implausible claims of fraud. Clark, too, embraced some of these claims, they said. And it's worth understanding that in the future, what Kyle Cheney is referring to as false claims, conspiracy theories, implausible claims, those are all just going to be true things that happened in the 2020 election that Kyle Cheney believes are debunked. And I'm actually kind of giving him the benefit of the doubt there, saying that he believes these things are debunked. He may well just be lying about them and know that they are not debunked and think that it's never going to matter because no one will ever be able to check and the result has already been certified and baked into the cake. Well, hey, good luck, Commie. I guess we're going to see how that goes. Let's continue. Philbin described feeling relief in the first days of January 2021 when he heard that Trump had ditched plans to appoint Clark as acting attorney general. But he quickly learned in discussions with his boss, Pat Cipollone, that two top DOJ officials, acting attorney general Jeff Rosen and his deputy Richard Donahue, that the effort had been revived. The men agreed that Philbin should speak to Clark, owing to their decades-long relationship, and attempt to discern what was happening. Oh, yeah. Hey, go find out what your friend is doing to try to contest this stolen election and report back. We would love to know their strategy so that it can be thwarted. Philbin, who testified for about 2 hours on Tuesday, described Clark as wildly misinformed about claims of election fraud, countenancing a theory about, quote, smart thermostats, end quote, being used to manipulate voting machines, and not sufficiently cognizant of the havoc it would wreak on the country if his plan succeeded. But he said Clark seemed 100% sincere in his beliefs. So Jeffrey Clark absolutely believed what he was saying and pushing for was true, according to Pat Philbin. Now, that should be the only thing that matters here. But of course, the purpose of this article is to divert from this fact and confirm in the minds of the child brains reading it that Jeffrey Clark is some kind of criminal. And let's go back to the two parts of this claim they just made. So one, he's believing in this theory about smart thermostats. Kyle Cheney frames it as these smart thermostats just somehow working on their own to manipulate voting machines. That's not what's being claimed. What's being claimed is that smart devices can be networked to the voting machines and then exploited through that, despite their quote unquote air gapping. So Cheney exaggerates the claim and decontextualizes it to the point where he is essentially just creating a straw man. Jeffrey Clark would not claim for a second that that is what he believed. So Kyle Cheney is misrepresenting the claim being made, or maybe it's Pat Philbin doing it, or maybe it's both. And then the argument moves immediately from a factual claim, which has been exaggerated, to this other claim about the potential dangers of the election result as it was reported to the public being quote unquote overturned, even though it was falsely reported in the first place. Let's continue with a quote from Philbin. He said, "I believe that he felt he essentially had a duty. I think Jeff's view was that there was a real crisis in the country and that he was being given an opportunity to do something about it." So Jeffrey Clark believed he was doing his duty in an honest fashion. Okay. When Philbin warned Clark that there would be riots in every major American city if Trump reversed the outcome of the election, Clark responded, "Well, Pat, that's what the Insurrection Act is for," Philbin recalled. And that is an excellent and correct answer from Jeffrey Clark. That is what the Insurrection Act is for. If a bunch of communist agitators and democratic terrorists funded by foreign entities and individuals, if they go out in the streets as Black Lives Matter Antifa and begin sowing chaos and destabilizing society, as is always done in color revolutions, which is what this is, the Insurrection Act could then be used to put down this insurrection. And perhaps one day we'll find out it was. We haven't seen a whole lot of Antifa over these past few years, even when we were certain they would be out there in the streets after the release of the leaked Dobbs decision from the Supreme Court. Clark, in Philbin's telling, was referring to a 19th century federal law that permits the president to use the military to quell civil unrest, an indication that he recognized the grave implications of his efforts. Though it was Philbin's first time publicly discussing the exchange, the conversation was captured in special counsel Jack Smith's indictment of Trump without naming either Philbin or Clark, though the identities of both speakers were easily discerned. On Tuesday, Philbin was asked to elaborate on this discussion. "I don't think I said anything on the phone. I just thought that showed a lack of judgment," he said. "Triggering riots in every major city in America, you've got to be really sure about what you're doing and have no alternatives. In my estimation, that was not the sort of situation we were talking about." And to be fair to Pat Philbin here, that is actually an acceptable viewpoint. And I believe that that was a conversation that was had at length in the Trump White House in serious fashion by serious people. I've been discussing this for years, as have many others. One of the potential outcomes in Trump pushing and exposing the fact that he actually won that election, one of the potential outcomes genuinely could be civil war in a worst case scenario. And when you understand the global regime and its goals, that civil war is something they find desirable, because then they get to push for UN peacekeeping forces or have other allied forces invade the country and attempt to put down the resistance, which would be patriotic Americans. And in that situation, once again, it would really all depend on whose side the U.S. military was on. But you don't even want to engage the possibility of that level of chaos unless you absolutely have to. And that is also what Pat Philbin says right there. He says, if there are no alternatives. Well, we are seeing an alternative, as uncomfortable as it may be for these 3.5 years so far. This is the alternative to civil war. And I think most of us would agree this alternative is much better. We should also consider the fact that they were absolutely prepared for it in 2020. In fact, they wanted it. They wanted that excuse. Now, if the regime and the Uniparty had strengthened their grip on control and been able to implement fully their agenda and remove Donald Trump and MAGA from the conversation completely, well, then you could say that we had our chance and we missed it. Even the possibility of civil war would have been worth it to avoid this. Okay, I mean, that's a position people can take. I wouldn't take that position. And the reason is because they haven't strengthened their grasp on control. They haven't strengthened their standing with the American public. They've been diminished in every possible way, including and especially their grip on control, their reputation on the world stage, their ability to actually wield power. They are embarrassing themselves in every possible venue. They are weaker every day. So it seems, at least for right now, the correct decision was made, despite how much it has sucked. Back to the article. Philbin was the second witness to testify in a disciplinary proceeding that could result in the loss of Clark's license to practice law. D.C. bar investigators have charged him with attempting to coerce DOJ leaders to embrace false claims of election fraud in order to pressure state legislators to consider reversing Trump's defeat in Georgia and other swing states. Trump, fuming at his DOJ leadership for what he contended was a failure to pursue fraud investigations, repeatedly flirting with appointing Clark as their leader, but ultimately backed down amid a mass resignation threat. This is another one of those claims that immediately goes away as soon as it becomes clear and obvious that there was election fraud, that the elections were stolen. All of these claims depend on Joe Biden actually having received 81 million real lawful American votes and the very violent insurrection actually being real. Neither of these claims can actually be supported with facts from the real world, and both are falling apart, not only factually, but in the minds of the American public. This, for them, is unsustainable. Clark has since been charged alongside Trump in Georgia for their efforts to overturn the election, and Clark was identified by Smith as a co-conspirator in the Washington, D.C. case. So those are all going to be fine. Fani Willis, that's her disaster down in Georgia, and Jack Smith's not going to get it done. Philbin said the mass resignation threat that caused Trump to back down from Clark's appointment was partially his idea. He recalled that a similar mass resignation threat from his days as a lawyer in the George W. Bush administration over warrantless wiretapping had similarly affected policy decisions. So he said he advised Rosen to take the temperature of DOJ leadership about how they would react if Trump appointed Clark as acting attorney general. Nearly every top DOJ official indicated they would resign, a significant factor in causing Trump to back off his plan. Well, good. I hope all of their names are recorded for that position they took. Philbin said he sought to convey these realities to Clark in a last-ditch phone call before a confrontational Oval Office meeting with Trump and his top advisors. We talked about some of the theories of fraud that were around. They'd been debunked, and there wasn't really any there, Philbin said. If the president made him acting attorney general, people at DOJ would probably resign. There's going to be just a massive wave of resignations. People weren't going to be following him to pursue these theories of fraud. Philbin said he was among those who would have resigned. It was not a course of action that I could countenance, Philbin said. I thought there was not a justification for it. It was a sufficiently bad idea and unjustified interference with the completion of the Electoral College count. I wouldn't want to be there in the White House any longer participating in that. Now, Philbin sounds like he is absolutely as compromised as the rest of the regime hacks he's referring to who would have resigned if Jeffrey Clark had been named acting attorney general. Now, there are people who believe that Jeffrey Clark was mixed up in some kind of regime-oriented op to get Trump to commit actual crimes or involve himself with legitimately false claims of fraud. But that take doesn't seem to make any sense to me in a world where Trump actually does have all the necessary information and knows what's going on. Now, if you want to say that Trump let Jeffrey Clark go out and expose himself, I guess you could argue that. But the idea that he's guilty of crimes as written in the Jack Smith indictment and the Fani Willis indictment, and that he was somehow wrong to pursue claims of election fraud, that strikes me as nonsensical. But let's move from the as yet unresolved outcome of the 2020 election to the potential for a 2024 election and remind ourselves that RFK Jr. is still running for some reason. Now, is he part of some information operation? Almost definitely. We don't know what side he's on. We don't know what purpose this campaign has. I'm still open to all of the possibilities, but to the extent that RFK Jr. is actually running a real campaign in an attempt to become president, he essentially just went out and shot himself in the foot in the past week or so, since the name of his vice presidential pick, his running mate, became known publicly. He had an event this week for the official announcement. This is NBC News. RFK Jr. names attorney Nicole Shanahan as his vice presidential pick. NBC refers to her as a wealthy attorney and entrepreneur. They write Shanahan, who like Kennedy has never run for elected office, has contributed to his campaign and his super PAC. Kennedy made the announcement at an event in Shanahan's hometown of Oakland. In explaining his decision, Kennedy said he wanted to choose a young athlete from a diverse background as his running mate and touted Shanahan's experience in tech and advocacy. And I'm starting to wonder if this article is also written by AI. What does it mean, a young athlete? Did they mean young female? I'm absolutely mystified. What am I reading today? Just the product of retarded AI. I am confident that there's no American more qualified to play this role than Nicole Shanahan, he said. Well, why didn't he just hire a young actress? Maybe that's what they meant to write. In her address, Shanahan railed against the Democratic Party, saying that it has lost its way and that she was formally leaving it behind. Oh, how bold. She also focused on concerns over the U.S. food supply, a top concern of Kennedy's, and expressed skepticism of medicine and vaccines, also a top Kennedy cause, claiming no safety study can assess the cumulative impact of one prescription after another, one shot after another and another, throughout the course of childhood. At one point, she raised concerns about electromagnetic pollution, elevating a conspiracy theory about the health effects of 5G and Wi-Fi signals. And hey, if he brings her on just so that conversation can be had in public, we are in great shape. Go ahead and get that subject to go mainstream. This independent movement comes at a time of extreme division in America that threatens to tear this country apart, Shanahan said. It's time for a realignment. It is time, as Bobby Kennedy says, to focus on our unifying values rather than our divisions. Take a close look at his vision for America, she continued. It is a vision that I share too, as I back his campaign and focus the next 7 months of my life getting him on each and every ballot in this country. They go on to note that some independents, in order to get their names on ballots, have to name a running mate, and that some of those deadlines are approaching quickly, and that explains the timing. The NBC article doesn't mention anything, though, about who Nicole Shanahan actually is or what aspects of her history people might want to know. This appears at time.com, but was originally published by Bloomberg July 25th, 2022. Nicole Shanahan, the woman at the center of the Musk-Brin rift. Silicon Valley entrepreneur and philanthropist Nicole Shanahan emerged this weekend at the center of a rift between two of the world's richest men, Sergey Brin and Elon Musk. Shanahan and Brin have been married for over 3 years, but announced in June they plan to divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. The Wall Street Journal reported this weekend that Musk and Shanahan had an extramarital affair, an allegation that Musk has since denied. Shanahan and Brin signed a prenuptial agreement and are currently negotiating the terms of their divorce, in which she seeks more than $1 billion, according to the report. That could put the settlement of her divorce in the same league as those of billionaire philanthropists Mackenzie Scott and Melinda Gates. So we are talking about Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Sergey Brin, all 100% regime-oriented billionaires in the tech space linked directly to every crime against America and crime against humanity that the regime has supported in this last decade and obviously longer than that. For 3 years of marriage to Sergey Brin, Nicole Shanahan thought she was entitled to $1 billion of his dollars. Now, I don't have to like Sergey Brin to know that that is insane. Now an attorney and a research fellow at Codex, the Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, Shanahan founded Clear Access IP, a Palo Alto-based firm that helps patent owners manage and monetize their intellectual property rights. It was acquired by rival IPWE in 2020. And intellectual property rights are certainly important. It would be interesting to know more about her views on that. A daughter of Chinese immigrants, Shanahan has talked about her mother, who worked as a maid and growing up on public assistance. According to her LinkedIn profile, she graduated from the University of Puget Sound in Washington State, where she studied economics, Asian studies, and Mandarin Chinese. She earned her law degree at Santa Clara University, doing a stint as an exchange student at the National University of Singapore. In 2019, Shanahan started her own foundation, Bia Echo, and pledged $100 million to reproductive longevity, access to medical technologies that help women bear children later in life, and criminal justice reform, along with other issues. She is also a supporter of left-leaning organizations and Democratic political candidates. I want to get the word out and assure everyone that I am committed as ever to dedicating my life's work to social justice, climate solutions, and a thoughtful, caring democracy, Shanahan said in an interview with Puck this month. And I actually think that as I move forward out of this separation, I feel very optimistic in how I might grow in this role. Now, a bunch of that information mirrors what's on her Wikipedia page, but there are some extra details of note on there. Here is the section on her charitable contributions. In 2018, Shanahan helped fund and launch the Center for Female Reproductive Longevity and Equality within the Buck Institute for Research on Aging. In 2019, she established her private foundation, Bia Echo. The foundation is named after Bia, the ancient Greek goddess associated with energy. In 2022, Shanahan's then-husband, Sergey Brin, donated at least $23 million in shares of Alphabet, Google's parent company, to Bia Echo. In 2019, Shanahan pledged to contribute $100 million over 5 years, mostly for research in reproductive longevity. Other beneficiaries of the contributions include programs that aim to overhaul the criminal justice system and climate change, as well as programs on nutrition and its link to fertility. In 2022, Shanahan gave $70 million to Blue Meridian Partners, which makes grants to nonprofits that aim to help the impoverished. And then there is this on her divorce from Sergey Brin. Shanahan and Brin separated in December 2021, and Brin filed for divorce in January 2022. Shanahan and Brin had signed a prenuptial agreement. During the divorce proceedings, Shanahan's attorneys argued that she had signed the prenuptial under duress and in mediation sought more than $1 billion of Brin's $95 billion fortune. The divorce was finalized in 2023. In 2022, the Wall Street Journal reported that a reason for the breakup was a brief affair between Shanahan and Musk. Shanahan and Musk have denied the report. Shanahan held a love ceremony of commitment with Jacob Strumwasser, who is an advisor at Lightning Labs, a Bitcoin software company. She described the event as a hand-fasting ceremony influenced by Druidic tradition. The pair met at the Burning Man Festival in summer of 2022. So all of this sounds a little hard to believe. And if it's all true, you have to wonder what RFK Jr. is thinking selecting this person if he is actually trying to win. And if you ask me, I don't think that any of that chain of necessary events for that to make sense is true. It's funny that they mention Melinda Gates and Mackenzie Scott in these articles with Nicole Shanahan, because we saw over that period that these corrupt and compromised tech billionaires, these regime billionaires, major philanthropists of the regime, they were all getting divorces. What happened? Were they all just falling out of love at the same time, or were they trying to protect parts of their fortune? It is very odd that a woman in her late 30s, who may well be a brilliant person and a good attorney, I have no idea, but we're talking about a woman who is involved in some strange biotech and technology projects and a fairly consistent donor to Democrat and leftist causes, whose money comes from having married a billionaire. And before that, she was also married to another rich guy, a man named Jeremy Asher Kranz, who was a San Francisco investor and finance executive. She has married 3 different rich guys in 10 years. What in the world is going on here, and why is RFK Jr. naming this person as his running mate? Does he need her money? Her influence? Is Google going to win the campaign for RFK Jr.? I'm just throwing out options here because otherwise it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. Trump addressed RFK Jr. and his announcement on Truth Social late last night, writing, RFK Jr. is the most radical left candidate in the race by far. He's a big fan of the Green New scam and other economy-killing disasters. I guess this would mean he is going to be taking votes from crooked Joe Biden, which would be a great service to America. His running mate, Nicole Shanahan, is even more liberal than him, if that's possible. Kennedy is a radical left Democrat and always will be. It's great for MAGA, but the communists will make it very hard for him to get on the ballot. Expect him and her to be indicted any day now, probably for environmental fraud. He is crooked Joe Biden's political opponent, not mine. I love that he is running, and it will be fun to see how that shakes out. And finally, this from Reuters on Monday. SWIFT planning launch of new central bank digital currency platform in 12 to 24 months. Global bank messaging network SWIFT is planning a new platform in the next 1 to 2 years to connect the wave of central bank digital currencies now in development to the existing finance system, it has told Reuters. The move, which would be one of the most significant yet for the nascent CBDC ecosystem, given SWIFT's key role in banking, is likely to be fine-tuned to when the first major ones are launched. Around 90% of the world's central banks are now exploring digital versions of their currencies. Most don't want to be left behind by Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, but are grappling with technical complexities. And they link to an earlier article from Reuters, March 13th. Countries closing in on digital currencies, but U.S. lagging, studies show. And that's a good thing. We would want the U.S. to be way behind in the implementation of a central bank digital currency. Actually, we want the U.S. to be so far behind that it simply never happens. And so it should come as welcome news that Reuters writes the research by the U.S.-based Atlantic Council think tank highlighted that all G20 countries, with the exception of Argentina, are now in one of those far along phases, although notably the United States is falling increasingly behind. While still inching forward on a banks-only wholesale digital dollar, one for the wider U.S. population now looked stalled, the report said, with Federal Reserve Chief Jerome Powell saying this month, nothing like that is remotely close to happening. U.S. President Joe Biden ordered officials to look into a digital dollar in 2022, but it has become a divisive political issue, with Biden's Republican rival in this year's U.S. election race, Donald Trump, vowing not to allow it. And if you have spent much time thinking about the actual regime agenda, this great reset agenda, where ultimately we end up owning nothing and being happy, We're going to share all of the things that we own. We will be assigned pairs of pants, an apartment, a couch, a bicycle, maybe if we behave. You're not going to have a car, but that's not going to matter because you're not going to be allowed to go anywhere anyway. You're going to exist in a 15-minute smart city. Everything you could possibly need will be available nearby. That is, if you're allowed to go get it, because of course the stores, they're going to have your vaccine ID digitized. It's going to be part of the same app as your digital wallet for your central bank digital currency that they can turn on and off anytime they want. They can turn off your ability to access virtually anything if you're not saying and doing the things that the regime demands. They'll turn off your access to your money. They'll turn off your access to go to the stores to spend the money. Their aim is the end of human liberty, and people think, oh, that can't be true. That can't be true. There's no way that the people would ever allow that. Well, what are you talking about? Half of the society accepted the mask and accepted the lockdowns and took the totally untested, unproven, and obviously unnecessary COVID vaccine just on the chance that the regime was telling the truth this time and would actually ease their suffering in the ways it was causing them to suffer. The CBDC is a necessary part of all of that. And they are telling us flat out that Donald Trump is thwarting it, and there's apparently nothing that can be done about it. And a couple of notes from that prior article. They write, the risk of the U.S. lagging behind was, quote, a more fractured international payment system, end quote, and that Washington could lose some of its global finance clout if other countries press on and set the new standards around CBDCs. Oh, no. I can't believe we're just going to allow other countries to get ahead of us on central banking control. The article concludes with this little tidbit. China's digital yuan is still the largest and most advanced pilot, having been trialed in various scenarios from public transport tickets and COVID checks to buying oil and precious metals. How about that? Public transport and COVID checks. What does access to public transport mean in a society where you do not have your own privately owned form of transportation? Well, I guess it means your ability to go anywhere. So they can control that with the CBDC. And what does it mean that they can control your COVID check with the CBDC in a world where you are on government basic income because you are just a useless eater now? That is part of the world where you will own nothing and you will be happy. But let's go back to the article about Swift's timeline and preparations. Swift's head of innovation, Nick Kerrigan, said its latest trial, which took 6 months and involved a 38-member group of central banks, commercial banks, and settlement platforms, had been one of the largest global collaborations on CBDCs and tokenized assets to date. It focused on ensuring different countries' CBDCs can all be used together, even if built on different underlying technologies or protocols, thereby reducing payment system fragmentation risks. That actually sounds like they want to implement 2 centralization points. They want it centralized at the country level and then centralized at this higher international level. 2 places where an outside centralized control system can affect the currency. And that is essentially a mirror of the fiat system we deal with now. Back to the article. It also showed they could be used in highly complex trade or foreign exchange payments and potentially be automated so to both speed up and lower the cost of the processes. Kerrigan said the results, which had also proven banks could use their existing infrastructure, had been widely regarded as a success by those who took part and given Swift a timeline to work to. Now, we are basically in a situation where we have a central bank digital currency. Most people don't use cash all that often. They use their debit cards. They pay with their phone. We even have degenerates paying with palm prints, eventually to be a chip placed in the hand. But people have essentially already adopted the same habits that they would adopt with a central bank digital currency. That is part of the lead-in to this program. Normalize chips, normalize internet payments, normalize no longer using cash, normalize the concept of coin shortages. All of that has become prominent just in these last few years. We are looking at a roadmap to productize, to launch as a product, in the next 12 to 24 months, Kerrigan said. It's moving out of experimental stage towards something that is becoming a reality. Although the time frame could still shift if major economy CBDC launches get delayed, getting out the blocks for when they do would be a major boost for maintaining SWIFT's incumbent dominance in the bank-to-bank plumbing network. Skipping down toward the end. The idea is that once the Interlink solution is scaled up, banks would have one main global connection point able to handle digital asset payments rather than thousands if they were to set up an individual one with every counterparty. As well as the advance toward CBDCs, Kerrigan pointed to a forecast from Boston Consulting Group that by 2030, around $16 trillion worth of assets could be, quote unquote, tokenized, a process where assets like stocks and bonds are transformed into digital chips that can then be issued and traded in real time. If we can plug in any number of networks into the SWIFT system, it becomes a much more scalable option for the industry, he said. And you know what solves that whole problem? Well, Bitcoin solves that problem. I'll be back tomorrow at the same reasonable time on the same reasonable podcast network. I don't have a network. Masks and lockdowns don't work. They lied to you about a pandemic, and Joe Biden will never be president.
In my mind, that's the end game.
If you're listening to this episode for free, you can support me and support the show and the work I do by signing up for a paid subscription at imyourmoderator.substack.com. You can do so for as low as $50 a year or $5 a month. Comes out to under a quarter per episode, and you'll blast right through the paywall for all of the writing. The merch store is www.cancelcouture.com, and you can find everything else by heading to Linktree, linktree.com/imyourmoderator. And I'll see you soon out on the range. It's high!